Okay, so welcome everyone to the book launch of the volume Detention and Deportation in Europe, Analyses, Contestations, and Radical Visions in the Aftermath of COVID-19. So this book, in today's book launch, the editors will introduce the volume and engage in conversations with some of the contributors who are already in the room. So this discussion discusses violence in carceral border regimes and their configurations in the aftermath of COVID-19, as well as present and past forms of resistance and contestations that help us to think about carceral border abolition. So I'll introduce the three editors and then I'll hand over to them. So we have Francesca Esposito, a researcher at the Department of Psychology at the University of Bologna, who is also an associate director at Border Criminologies. We also have Annika Lindberg, who is an assistant lecturer at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg. So last but not least, we have Teresa Degenhardt, a reader in criminology at Queen's University Belfast. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Francesca to briefly introduce the whole book and also what will happen next in the book launch.
Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Thank everyone for joining today. We're glad and also excited to be here and to be having this conversation around this book, which it's titled Detention and Deportation in Europe, Analyses, Contestations and Radical Visions in the Aftermath of COVID-19, which was a project which spanned over almost 3 years. So it has been a journey and we're very excited to be here today and to be able to use it to spark conversations that we think are very important. And we want to thank the Border Criminologies Network for hosting us and supporting us throughout, and also to all the speakers, amazing scholar, activists, comrades who are here that joined for different parts of the world and to be in conversation. We really appreciate a lot your work and your generosity for being here with us. And the times we are living through are marked by profound and compounding crises. This age of polycrisis, as some have defined it, marked by wars, genocides, border imperialism, extractive capitalism, and climate catastrophe, demands that we confront how formations of structural, cultural, and epistemic violence organize the very conditions for our communal life, fracturing the possibility for it to flourish. And when we started writing the collective volume that we're presenting here today in the summer of, we were writing the introduction in summer 2024, the project started earlier. The media reported instances of migrant people being attacked by coordinated racist, white supremacist, neo-imperialist movements across the UK, unleashed under the rubric Stop the Boats. Organized racist violence has tragically continued to unfold throughout, with more and more people being policed, incarcerated, deported, and exposed to premature death. And we are very sad and concerned about what continues to happen in communities across the globe where racist and anti-immigrant violence persists. And in a moment, I will give the floor to Teresa to say a few words on what is happening as we're speaking in Northern Ireland, and that we're extremely concerned and we feel we need to name and mention. And as we gather today, just days before the full implementation of the European Pact on Migration and Asylum on 12 June 2026, and days after the European Council and the European Parliament reached a political agreement on the so-called new regulation, return regulation, a regulation that significantly expands detention, including the risk of detaining children, introduce so-called return hubs outside the EU, which are colonial penal colonies, sorry, in other parts of the world, and increases coercive measures against those who refuse to leave. We are acutely aware of what is at stake. These political developments entail significant and growing investments in organized violence against people crossing borders and racialized as migrants and foreigners. And they do so at very concrete costs. As critical scholarship and activist documentation make plain, asylum approval rates are declining, detention centers are expanding, and the budgets of immigration enforcement, policing, and deportations agencies continue to grow. All these unfolding alongside and at the direct expenses of the collective system that sustain our collective life, public education, healthcare, housing, and social welfare. So these developments crystallize what we have been arguing throughout the volume. All the contributors have been arguing that border enforcement is not a neutral administrative function, but a political project, one built on organized violence and one that demands our collective resistance and our collective imagination. And I will now hand it over to Teresa for a few words on the concerning developments unfolding in Belfast as we speak. We can't hear you, Tere.
I should know by now. I still forgot to unmute myself. So thank you, Francesca, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm based in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and last night in the street in the north of Belfast, there was a brutal attack by a person of color, for what we know now, to a local individual. I cannot go into the details of the events for reason of time now. However, this tragedy is now unfortunately being exploited by some politicians who continuously appeal to the police to release the facts to the public, by which they mean to release the nationality of the attacker. The far right is circulating the apparently horrific video online and appealing to local men to get to the street, saying every brown person is a target. We are on a curfew at the moment. My son came home earlier. I was sent home earlier from work. This sort of instrumentalization of race, citizenship, is linked to the violent border regimes that criminalize people on the move, and increasingly on everyone who appears different. We definitely need to get together to think differently and to imagine a different world.
Thanks, Teresa, for sharing these updates that are very concerning, and I think at the core of what we will discuss today. In the volume, against the backdrop of this poly-crisis, we chose to locate ourselves in the aftermath of COVID-19, which was one of the major global crises that made visible the stark contrast between our present structures of oppression and the radical care and solidarity it takes to confront and survive the modern colonial world system. And this volume arises from these reflections and the awareness that all the individuals confined in the immigration detention and deportation centers around the world have been and continue to be strongly affected by the short, medium, and long-term consequences of this poly-crisis. And they're also among the most invisibilized and silent. And this was very evident during COVID-19, and it continued in the aftermath. In a sense, their lives are placed by those in power on a different, inferior value scales, as if their deaths are not even worthy of their need. And this project, this writing project took shape from a previous writing project that myself and two colleagues, Emilio Caia and Giacomo Mattiello, started during the COVID-19, which we felt the urgency alongside many others to document what was happening inside Italian detention centers. And then it evolved in a collective volume, which was published in Italian. And then we decided with Annika and Teresa to expand it further to the European landscapes, including contributions from different parts of Europe, Italy, Greece, Spain, Britain, Northern Ireland, Serbia, Poland, the Nordic countries, Germany, alongside powerful artistic interventions in the form of poems written by people with lived experience of detention and by activists. These poems bring to life the emotional impact of incarceration, offering compelling counter-narratives, analyses, and critical reflections of both life in detention and the system that contour and sustain it. And while it is empirically focused on Europe, the analyses and insights that are offered in the volume draw on and contribute, we hope, to global conversations on border carcerality and its inherent violence. And we have also in the concluding remarks, activists like our comrade Seterek, who is here with us from Detention Watch Network, who work in the US, exactly because we think these conversations are not specific to certain regions, but are global conversations, and what we're witnessing are systems of power that are unfolding transnationally, as transnational needs to be our response and resistance. So collectively, these contributions are guided by twofold quest to describe the development proliferations of carceral border systems during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, and to discuss lessons learned and struggles for their abolition. Struggles that envision an end to carceral border violence and the radical reimagining of our futures and the world we live in. And I will now hand it over to Annika, who will introduce some key concepts and frameworks that oriented our reflections and analysis. And thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Francesca, and echoing all the thanks to everyone both hosting and participating in the space with us today. So I just briefly wanted to, very briefly now, as I think Francesca gave a very beautiful introduction to the aims and purpose of the book, and Tere as well, name three sort of frameworks and three parts of our inquiry that we addressed, with which we addressed both academic colleagues, activist comrades, and poets and artists to participate in this book project. So we use the term carceral border control or carceral border violence to describe not just detention sites, but a continuum of carceral control practices, including immigration detention, deportation flights, asylum camps, quarantine zones, electronic tags and surveillance technologies, and welfare restrictions, which we see as interconnected sites and mechanisms designed to contain, punish, and expel people whose unruly mobilities are challenging the colonial, racial capitalist world order that we live in today. Together, they form a system that is deeply racialized, profoundly gendered, and historically rooted in colonial logics. They do inflict immense harm, which many of us are acutely aware and have lived through. And they are manifestations of structural racism that exposed racialized border crosses to premature death. So as such, of course, they are indefensible to us. And as this volume makes clear, this is just one out of many interventions on these topics, but these carceral border systems, they thrive on moments of crisis, and COVID being no different than others. Thank you, Diana. I'll try to slow down. So in the volume, we argue that COVID-19 should be understood not as a pandemic, but as a syndemic. We borrow this perspective from Meryl Singer, who used it to describe the AIDS pandemic in the 1990s, to highlight the importance of structural factors and societal inequalities in shaping people's experiences of ill health and also their differential exposure to harm, illness, and death. So Syndemic helps us to understand how the distribution of protection against the virus was shaped by colonial, racial, gendered, and class logics, locally as well as globally. And if COVID-19 was and its aftermath have been marked by sort of polycrisis, as Francesca mentioned, this health crisis was also a crisis of racism, police and border violence across the globe. It was also a period marked by massive mobilization, by the visibilization of all the organizing happening to build other solidarity networks, mutual aid practices, and life-sustaining networks for those who have been abandoned or violently excluded by states and their corporate allies. So therefore, the third term or perspective that we want to introduce and foreground is abolition. Which we understand, of course, as both an analytical perspective and a method geared towards dismantling violent carceral border regimes, including prisons, detention centers, organized abandonment, and also to build and create the conditions necessary to render borders, prisons, and detention centers obsolete. In the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, to build a world where life is precious, there life is precious, right? And so with these three themes in mind, we invited the contributions, and we were so immensely glad to have such a fantastic variety of rich perspectives provided by scholars, activists, artists, providing poems, chapters offering diagnosis, and also conversations on radical alternatives, visions, and ways forward to build a more life-sustaining world. I will now briefly introduce the amazing contributors who could be here with us today. So we have Ana Ballesteros Pena, who is a senior research fellow at the University of A Coruña in Spain. Aino Corvensiria, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies, University of Bristol, UK, and at the University of Helsinki. Teresa Degenhardt, who has already been introduced, who will also introduce her chapter today. Setare Gandahari, who is the advocacy director at Detention Watch Network in the US. Diana Daduch, who's a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Brighton and coordinates the feminist No Border Struggles research strand at the Feminist Autonomous Center for Research, joining us from Italy, together with Sheikh Sene, who is vice president of the Ragazze Baie Fall Association, coordinator of the Maldusa space in Palermo, Italy. We have David Moyo, who is an artist using his lived experience of detention and criminalization to change and challenge the system, advocating for a more just world. A member of Beyond Detention Friendship Group, collaborator with Association of Visitors to Immigration Detainees, and a founding member of the Unchained Collective in the UK. And we have Elahi Sirdavar, aka Eli Shakiba, who is an award-winning artist, architect, journalist, and documentary filmmaker, and whose amazing artwork constitutes the cover of our book, features on the cover of our book, for which we are immensely grateful. And I will now, yes, thank you, Tere, for sharing that. And I'm very pleased to hand over the word to you, Elahi, to please share with us your beautiful poem and thereby open the book launch. We can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
yes, lovely.
It was just fine. I don't know what happened. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Annika, for the introduction. I'm So honored to be here today and going to read you a poem that I assumed that was breaking news at the time when we started the discussion. But it just got worse. Breaking news. Attention folk, an ancient curse has occurred. Snake Shoulder is back to life to run the world. Disasterly, man is lost in countless poles. Northern, southern, eastern, western homeless souls. Highest fences running to the land of Mars. The border forces extracting bills of bars. Manipulations provided for brain soup. Peoples have been divided by the saints' troop. What is gained? Blown up earth's endless bloody wars. Men have failed for Viagra, wealth, weapons, cars. God is bold, the sun has fallen, love is burned. Such is life, the dead forgotten, truth is spurned. The good Lord has been dreaming well, blanket is nice and fluffy, borders are bleeding, declared the National Geography. Thank you so much for having me and for listening to my poem. I'm going to hand it over to Annika.
Thank you so much, Eli, for so powerfully opening the conversations today. I will now turn to Anna, Aino, and Teresa, in whichever order you wish to address our first question to you, which is if you would tell us a bit about what key patterns and features you observed in terms of carceral border controls and how they were restructured during the COVID pandemic. How did these patterns or features continue or did not continue in its aftermath? So I'll give the floor to whoever wants to go first, and I'll let you follow after one another.
I know. Do you want to start or and Teresa as well?
You can start.
Okay. I go then. So thank you very much also to Francesca, Annika, and Teresa for coordinating this book and for inviting me to be part of it. It has been a pleasure, and I think it is a great book and very important considering also the times and the evolution of border control over time. So for addressing the case of Spain, I will start by saying that in the case of Spain, the most characteristic pattern, let's say, that happened during the pandemic was the closure of immigration detention centers, formal immigration detention centers, for several months since the beginning of the pandemic until for 5 months, around 5 months. These were the good news, let's say, and they were reopened, and when they were reopened, in some jurisdictions or some regions, particularly in the Canary Islands, they still remain empty for several more months. There were not an official closure, but neither police forces nor judges were sending people to immigration detention centers. Just in the Canary Islands, in the immigration detention centers in the mainland, they were reopened, but they were not a lot of people detained there. Because it is true that this pattern came from before, the number of people detained in immigration detention centers declined for several years before and continue in low numbers even today. And this is connected with other patterns that I am going to share with you now. So this is the first element, but the pandemic went also hand in hand with the increase of arrivals to the Canary Islands. And these arrivals of the Canary Island resulted in a response that expanded and like consolidated certain patterns that had begun before, a few years before, when the number of people arriving to the southern coast of the mainland, like the Andalusian coast, were a rise since 2017 approximately. And what are these elements that expanded and consolidated during the pandemic? The first one is the creation of new short-term detention centers for detaining people for just 72 hours in order to classify, do some screening, and then distribute them, let's say, either to immigration detention centers, straight to deportation, or then after this screening process, they were like transferred to other kind of centers that are the second element that expanded and consolidated, that was the development and expansion of a network or so-called humanitarian centers run by NGOs, not the police. That is the case of detention centers and these new short-term centers, where people were not formally detained, so they could be outside during the day, and they could leave the place, and in theory they could be there for several months until they leave or they were transferred to other places. That is true that they were not formal detention centers, but in certain moments in Ireland they could act as such. And also these centers, and this is something that continue now, were also expanded to the mainland, so people were transferred from the island to the mainland. And it is true that at the moment there are some concerns about the prohibition and the forbidden for the people to leave the centers, and some patterns that are more connected with kind of carceral logics, more than like the free movement for the people who are inside. The third element is like the restriction of mobility that we saw during the pandemic, particularly in the island. So in theory, in the country, when you are you get into the country, then you can move freely, even though you are undocumented. The issue was, and the problem was, that during the pandemic, the airports at some points were closed in the island, and there were some racial profiling for the people, for Black people who try to travel on their own expenses, like buying their tickets to the mainland, or to continue when travel were allowed again. And there were some restrictions of mobility that were not common before. But then after the pandemic, this situation, and after some demands, and they were finished. And the last point was that, and also this pattern started before, was the elimination, let's say, or the reduction of the detention of women in immigration detention centers, and also deportation upon arrival. The thing is, when women arrived to the coast, they were not detained in immigration detention centers or transferred to immigration detention centers or deported. They were transferred to these more kind of humanitarian centers, and this pattern had continued, particularly in these areas. What we continue seeing is that women detained in immigration detention centers in the mainland, that normally are women that have lived in the country for years or decades, and are normally women that are sex workers, or they work in the domestic work. So they are some kind of focus on this group of people in the case of women. The rest, this is so-called trying to treat them better because the gender condition, even though there are a lot of questions to problematize in this approach as well. And finally, just to talk about the current moment, and this is not connected to the pandemic, but in the case of Spain, we are what is happening today is a process of extraordinary regularization of undocumented migrants. So people until the end of the month can apply under certain conditions for getting people undocumented to getting documents, so to regularize the situation in the country, which is good news. It has been after a long fight from civil society groups in order to make this happen. It is true that there are also some concerns about issues that are in obstacles that institutions are putting in place for this, but this is happening. But in parallel, and these are the kind of paradoxes that we see in all of this process. At the same time, we see the Ministry of Interior and the police still detaining people and putting them in detention and deporting even those who have their documents prepared to apply for this regularization. So we see this these two elements happening at the same time. That shows that even though we can see positive issues related to some patterns that we can see in the case of Spain, they are always hand in hand with other not positive processes that are happening at the same time. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that wonderful summary and also highlighting these different trends. Aino, did you want to go next?
I can. Thank you so much for organizing this and also for putting the book together. And yeah, it's really valuable. And thanks everybody for showing up today. So yeah, I'm talking about Germany. So my chapter focused on asylum camps in Germany. And these are facilities where people go through both asylum procedures and deportation procedures. And deportations are also conducted from these facilities. And the larger ones are called reception centers in Germany, which is a quite misleading term. If you consider all this activity happening in there, they are typically semi-open. So residents may leave during the day or stay away a few days, but they cannot exit the municipality without the special permission of the immigration authority. And after the outbreak of COVID-19, many of these camps went to complete lockdown. So that was what happened in Germany. So residents were not allowed to leave at all, even to get basic necessities or meet anybody. And sometimes these lockdowns lasted for months. Rather than protecting the residents, these measures obviously exposed them to increased infection risk. So in many camps, many people got infected. Official narratives framed the residents themselves as a public health risk, which mirrored how other racialized and migrant-sized populations were framed during the time. So for instance, workers in food production or logistics. And this framing was reinforced regarding the asylum camps through police raids, which were often responding to protests by residents, and by forced transfers and even the deployment of the military to enforce pandemic measures, which consolidated this depiction of residents both as a health risk and a security risk. In hindsight, we can see these measures as a sort of laboratory of this recent EU asylum reform that was mentioned already, which is currently being implemented and which is trying to shift most asylum and deportation procedures into closed detention. In my chapter, I'm also looking at the continuities from the pre-COVID period in southern Germany, which is a region with long history of restrictive camp policies and where I conducted fieldwork and organizing across the decade after 2015. There were hundreds of intensive police raids that targeted asylum camps in the years leading to COVID-19 lockdowns. And I have also argued elsewhere in another article that these raids sought to repress both spontaneous protest of the residents against deportation enforcement that happened during the night, and also their protest against these general conditions in the camps. That was lack of work permits, limited mobility, inadequate healthcare, policing, and criminalization, and also constant violence by guards. And these raids that happened just before COVID also reinforced these narratives of asylum seekers as dangerous and aggressive. For instance, this happened in a very highly published case in 2018 in the Ellwangen reception center in southern Germany in Baden-Württemberg, which housed many West African residents. And the same camp was then targeted by a 2-month lockdown into 2020. And in my chapter, I'm situating this racialized control that had this continuity from pre-COVID to COVID. And after that, I'm situating it in a broader context by tracing first transnational histories of racialized confinement through from colonialism through fascism and to the emergence of these West German asylum camps in the late 1970s. And I'm drawing on critiques by activists who have organized within these camps to argue that these facilities emerged to capture and control the mobility of people who escaped new rounds of dispossession in the global south after the end of formal colonialism. I'm secondly also following the trajectory of these struggles of these people inside the camps and how the state responded. So I'm looking at the emergence of self-organized activism in the 90s, and how this movement peaked in the years 2012, 2014, and how it was then repressed and also co-opted by this so-called welcome culture in 2015, when Germany welcomed 1 million asylum seekers, and then also how renewed struggles emerged after 2015 and were met even with harder criminalization. And I'm using the term isolation to understand these combined state strategies of repression and pacification. Isolation is a notion that was developed in the self-organized resistance within the camps since the 1990s that included many Black organizers in groups like the Boys Refugee Forum and later Women in Exile. Isolation describes policies that aim to isolate the residents in the camps from one another and also from the wider society in order to prevent and weaken collective organizing. Isolation works through remote locations of the camps, mobility restrictions, racialized policing, criminalization, imposed poverty, and individualized legal procedures and other divide and rule strategies. While such measures aim to demoralize camp residents and stifle their collective resistance, racist public narratives and deservingness hierarchies also seek to dissuade majority populations from supporting residents' protests. So we can understand isolation as a tool of counterinsurgency and pacification. And through this notion, we can understand more critically what is happening at the present moment when EU seeks to shift asylum and deportation processes to closed detention facilities at the external borders and beyond, including in these planned return hubs that Francesca mentioned in third countries. And it's also important to attend to these historical dynamics of resistance and racialized state violence because it allows us to see how these measures are a further form of political repression that targets efforts to organize across legal status and across the global color line to dismantle these detention regimes. And just to close, I also addressed this recent conjuncture, and I think it's important to keep in mind that we are seeing an intense normalization in the last 2 years of extreme forms of racialized confinement and genocide in Gaza, which is supported by the German state, and attempts to criminalize all opposition. So this really underscores how urgent it is to critically examine these transnational histories and also contemporary realities of racialized confinement that underpin all nation states, so that we can identify possibilities to create abolitionist solidarity and alliances to challenge both borders and imperialism and occupation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aino, also for foregrounding both the historical and the internationalist global perspectives that we need to keep in mind. Tere, please, the floor is yours.
So, Yes, I'm going to speak about the chapter I've authored for the book, which is on Northern Ireland. So before I do so, it is important to place Northern Ireland in its kind of weird political context, because formally Northern Ireland is part of the UK as a jurisdiction. Its detention centres are directed by the Home Office in the UK. However, Northern Ireland is situated in the island of Ireland, and it is currently, because of the Brexit referendum, divided formally from the Republic of Ireland by what is a new European border. But the border is invisible for the local population because this state is contested. It's a post-conflict society in which some people hold a British passport, other people hold an Irish passport, and the violence that affected this community is now being turned against the new outsiders, the migrants. This place had not seen many migrants before the enlargement of the European Union. So I'm going to talk about, in the chapter, I talk about what happened during the COVID pandemic in Larne Detention Centre. This is a short-term holding facility, which means a detention centre in which people can only be held for maximum of 5 to 7 days to then be moved on to immigration removal centre to then be deported. As the COVID pandemic was declared by the government, many groups started organizing, contesting the fact that people would be kept in these detention sites at the high risk of contagion with no prospect of being then deported, which is supposedly the function of these detention centers. So, as in Spain, what we've seen, even a little bit less than in Spain, what we've seen in the whole of the UK was a form of decarceration. So the pressure from organized group on the basis of health was actually quite powerful in getting the government to release many, many migrants from these detention sites, which is an extraordinary achievement. And even more extraordinary is the fact that people didn't really complain of this move, meaning that maybe it's not really an issue if migrants are actually. However, not everyone was detained, and here we see the structural issue that the pandemic actually highlighted. Some people were still kept inside, some were kept in the detention centers, others were kept in prisons, and the conditions within both detention center and prisons were much more coercive than they were before. So people would be kept in isolation to check that they were not infected, even if the rooms were very, very narrow. People would not have access to any form of contact. They would have no contact with the lawyers. They wouldn't know what would happen to them. Very often, they would stay for longer time in prison just because of the risk of COVID. So the conditions were much more coercive for those who were inside. And another aspect that we notice at this crisis time is that the tendency of the system is to contain what we call here foreign national offender, meaning people who were charged with an offense and have a different citizenship, and asylum seekers, because at the time of COVID, the emergence, the government started to put the emphasis on the threat of migrants coming by small boats through the channel. And the majority of people who came by small boats applied for asylum. 90% of people applied for asylum, which meant that the government started to criminalize asylum seekers effectively. And this policy of criminalization of asylum seeker is what continues on with different cycles of legislation by conservative governments, but also by the Labour government. So this is certainly a feature that is continuing from the syndemic, and that reinforces the kind of structural vulnerability of some migrants compared to others. The other feature that I actually try to foreground in the chapter is the lack of care. So, and the endurance of the private and state contract and alliance in the maintenance of this business system effectively. So detention centers in the UK are all managed by private contractor who gain profit, millions of pounds by detaining people. And they portray themselves, at least the one in Northern Ireland, Mighty, which won an extraordinary contract for 525 million pounds in 2018 for 10 years of detention, portrays itself as caring. Its motto is care and custody. And it's care, it's a way of obfuscating, obviously, the violence of the state, the violence of the system. So COVID health emergency demonstrated that market forces were not able to support life everywhere, and that we needed to create a different system of care. In the detention center, in the crisis of COVID-19, demonstrated the same thing. Migrants in detentions were not cared for in spite of the attitude of some officers. They were just managed and abandoned for the sake of the state demonstration of its power. On the opposite, solidarity came from ordinary people, even sometimes from places that were not expected to demonstrate solidarity towards the migrants. So I think I'm up with my time. I can see that people are tired of listening to us speaking, and maybe it's time for a poem, or what is it coming next?
Thank you so much, Tere. Thank you also for foregrounding the business of detention, such an important insight, and the issues of care. Indeed, it is time for another poem. Very pleased to hand over the word to you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me in this panel. This is very interesting and very powerful. This poem, I wrote this poem when I was detained, and how I was treated by the system. Really, I felt different at that time. Even now, I'm outside, but I feel different. Because you can come out and you carry the scar in the community. It's me. Okay, my poem reads, I'm different. I'm different because I feel different, and I'm made to feel different. Here I am in the detention center, and everyone looks at me differently. Is it because I am different by color, by gender, by religion, or by my past? I'm different because I am different in the center, or because I am made to feel different? Is it because I have no freedom of movement or because I have a mental health problem, as I feel insecure, everyone who is supposed to be looking out for me sees me differently. Even when I am at home, being given the freedom, I still feel differently. Is it because I still have a tag? I am not a danger to the society I live around with. I'm different because I still feel that my past is constantly triggered by the people, especially the Home Office, as they seem to treat me differently in a harsh manner. I am different because I never raised by my mother, who was supposed to show me love. I never knew what love is, and I feel different. That's my poem. Thank you so much.
Thank you so, so much for sharing this with us, David.
Thank you.
Ron. Thank you. Francesca, I'll hand over the word to you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank David for sharing this very painful but also insightful poem where he really shed light on the way that carceral state violence it's part of a continuum of violence that people face across their lives, and also the way these systems, whatever, regardless of the rhetorics and official language that they use, they're profoundly oppressive, violent, and criminalizing people's lives, and how the harms they produce also reverberate throughout and long after people have left those doors. So I think it's really important, like these insights. And I think poems oftentimes, even more than academic scholarships, are able to point towards like key points that, how these systems work and how we can also challenge them. Without any further ado, I'll go to the second round. And we would like to invite some contributors, colleagues, comrades who are here and who contributed to also a very beautiful afterwards based on a workshop that we organized with Abolitionist Futures, where we discussed struggles and resistance and struggles around carceral border violence around the globe. And so I would like to ask them, to Diana, Sheikh, Tetere, and to whoever wants also to join, what forms of resistance and contestation you think you saw emerging in the period of the COVID-19 and also in its aftermath, and also what lessons can we learn from these struggles and these different forms of resistance, which can help us think about carceral border abolition in the present juncture, which is characterized by polycrisis. So I'll open the floor to you. You can choose like to speak in whatever order you prefer. I don't know if you, Satara, you want to go first.
Sure, I'm happy to go. Thanks. Congratulations on the book, and thanks so much for having me. I don't know where to start because there's so much happening now. 2020 I think was sort of a flashpoint in organizing against detention in the U.S., and I think we're kind of experiencing that now in a lot of ways. So it's interesting to step back and take a look at 2020 right now. I think one thing that has most recently come up in terms of a point of comparison between what's happening now and what happened in 2020 is what we've been seeing in terms of inside organizing. So people inside of detention centers in the United States, organizing and resisting their detention from the inside. And over the last week or two, we've seen hunger strikes at several detention centers in the US. And this is, who knows where it will go. It seems to be, the conditions inside facilities right now are they've been awful, and they're getting worse and worse as the detention system is expanding rapidly. And, we may be seeing more of these hunger strikes pop up across the country. And this is something that happened during the COVID pandemic in 2020, where we saw something like 49 hunger strikes across the detention system in the United States. So there are over 200 detention centers in the US, from major, huge private prison facilities to state local jails. Basically, there's a variety of places where people are detained. And across this system, people used, one of the things that so much is restricted on people inside of detention, but this is something that people have control of. And so these hunger strikes were really important to bring attention to what was happening inside of facilities at the time, to help foster sort of the relationship between people engaging in this resistance inside, and the support system and the support networks on the outside that were, supporting them, and then kind of using that moment as a opportunity to bring more people into the movement to end immigration detention in the United States. So yeah, I just wanted to lift that up because we're starting to see that happen again in the United States. But I guess also wanting to underscore the role of people who were detained themselves in resistance, and how much that really grew during 2020. I mean, it's always been there, not to suggest that isn't always the case, but it was so in your face during that time. There was sort of the other, people were engaging in car protests, driving to detention centers, and kind of a march in their cars in order to ensure that they were social distancing. People really started turning to digital methods of organizing, Zoom meetings, these kinds of spaces, because they couldn't gather in person. So all of that, I think, also made it harder to organize, but also in some ways opened up the space and allowed people to participate in organizing in a way, that maybe they couldn't before if they didn't have those in-person connections. I think the other thing that happened during that time that had a huge impact on resistance in the US was the racial justice uprisings that happened that same summer and overlapped with COVID, the summer of 2020, and the George Floyd protests, as a result of the brutal murder of George Floyd by police in the United States. And that sort of brought attention to the concept of abolition broadly in the US, and so many groups that, we had worked with for many years who organized to kind of reduce detention or intervene on conditions, but hadn't quite made the leap to abolition or to calling for an end to all detention. All of a sudden, we're thinking about that because of the way that that summer brought attention to the concept of abolition more broadly. And I think we're also seeing that now, that we had a little bit of a backlash moment after the election in the US, after sort of the COVID pandemic died down. there was a little bit of like a walking back of that progress. And now with everything that's happening in the US, we're kind of seeing the pendulum swing again. So I thought, that was really, really interesting, because so many groups that hadn't been on board with abolition before were now calling for an end to detention because of all of the attention on what was happening inside of detention centers. And, I don't have to say it. I think it's clear that like when people were inside of these facilities, they weren't able to observe all of the recommendations, in terms of social distancing. They weren't given masks, often denied, sanitary supplies, soap, and all of these things to protect themselves inside of detention. And so, the hunger strikes I mentioned before, a lot of that was, to demand access to those things, but, first and foremost, to demand release. So, yeah, I guess I can, and I guess the other thing that I'll say is all of that sort of attention on abolition, attention on the detention system is what led us to create the resource that that is referenced in the afterword in the book. We sort of looked to the abolitionist movement that had, been built up over many, many years of thinking and organizing, especially from Black feminists in the US, to think about like, how do we achieve abolition of the immigration detention system in the US? And, with all of these new organizations and new people joining the movement, we wanted to provide a resource that could help people think through, when they're doing their organizing, when they're doing their policy advocacy, what are policy changes that are reformist in nature and would really strengthen the system, for example, improving conditions. That wasn't our goal. Our goal is to end the system, not make it nicer, versus policy interventions that would actually shrink the system and lead to an end of it ultimately. So we created this resource that we, at Detention Watch Network use to this day, and is just a huge, has been, I think, a real help, especially for people who are new to the movement or who are new to abolition, to think through what does policy advocacy look like that's abolitionist and leads us to ending the system. So I think those are some positive developments that came out of that time, that very tragic time. There were a number of deaths in ICE custody. At that time, we had hit some record numbers of deaths inside of ICE detention. Again, like we're at that point now. We just hit 50 deaths inside of ICE detention under the current Trump administration just at the end of last week, which is just a record number, unconscionable. So it's, as I said before, it's an interesting moment to be thinking about 2020 because of what's happening now, and sort of this, it's kind of the next big moment, and there's a lot of organizing happening, a lot of parallels, and I think a lot of growth and a lot of building on what resistance, how resistance grew in that time.
Thank you so much, Sefre, and also for sharing these analyses, and also for like all the work that you and our comrades at the Detention Watch Network are doing, and this really important resource that you developed in terms of thinking at reformist reforms versus non-reformist reforms or abolitionist reforms, which I think is extremely, extremely helpful for those on the ground who are trying to push for transformative changes that can help us reach our final goal, which is to end with these carceral systems, as we want to end also with other carceral systems as well. So thank you for that. And I will hand it over now to Dan and Sheikh for sharing some of their insights and struggles from Italy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diana, and Sheikh just had to leave 1 second. because as usual, we had arranged childcare, but then as soon as we have to speak, the child pops up. So we're sorry. Okay, here we are. Yeah, so as you introduced earlier, we are, well, I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, but I'm also an organizer, and I'm currently in the Maldusa space in Palermo.
Ciao a tutti e tutte, io sono Sersene e sono anche attivista, ricercatore e ho fatto un po' l'esperienza vissuta come migrante, quindi negli ultimi anni mi sono focalizzato di più sulla detenzione, appena vissuto il sistema giuridico, ma anche il trattamento del viaggio e quindi durante il Covid-19 anche noi come collettivo immigrante che esiste in una comunità dove tutte queste cose che lottiamo sono le cose che noi lottiamo per noi stessi, nostra libertà, i nostri spazi di esserci, quindi era un momento incluso penso che era, vuol dire che momenti peggiori della nostra vita come detenzione da carcere anche da fuori e quindi noi le chiamiamo come forme di resistenza e quindi questo è il motivo in cui noi facciamo questa contribuzione per porre anche noi dei linguaggi come comunità migrante che già abbiamo l'esperienza di colonialismo anche arrivando di più sugli accordi, sui nuovi patti anche e l'intenzione sono anche un sistema qui già abbiamo saputo tanto anche dentro i nostri lotti come immigranti, come braccianti, come detenuti abbiamo avuto gli stessi processi, gli stessi avvocati, ma diversi tavoli diversi, quindi non si capisce niente, ma comunque c'è qualcuno che subisce, qualcuno che cerca una uscita per capire di più.
So I will start translating. Sheikh is an activist and a researcher from Senegal, lives in Palermo, and is active in the Bayefal community and the Maldusa space where we are now. And he has a lived experience of migration and detention. And he's in the past years, has been focusing his activist and research work as well on detention here in Palermo and more broadly in Sicily. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the migrant community here in Palermo was at the forefront and at the center of struggles against detention, and but also struggles outside of detention, seeing the continuities between inside and outside of prison. Migrant communities kept fighting also in these very difficult conditions to end this system, but also to bring new languages that were anti-colonial and anti-racist, and bringing together different positionalities, detainees, seasonal workers, and several other migrant communities are characterized and labeled as different, but in these struggles they found their commonalities. Also, everyone, of course, is legally framed in a different way, but their struggles are the same.
Sì, per questo penso che sì, l'esperienza qui noi portiamo avanti, quindi è un'esperienza che per noi sì, siamo noi che dobbiamo esserci prima fila in quanto alla comunità immigrante, quindi qui come ragazzi Baifal e Maldusa vogliamo anche mettere di più la pratica di cui viviamo su ciò che abbiamo vissuto, come siamo condannati, come abbiamo vissuto queste condanne, come siamo processati diversi tribunali. Per me è questo, quando sentite voi parlando sui sopra, sulle CPR, È molto importante avere questo approccio qui da portare per abolire i carceri o per abolire anche le frontiere, perché lì si tratta di una revisione, si tratta anche di una solidarietà. E quindi durante il Covid, anche come ragazzi BIFAL collettivo, che nel gruppo dove ci sono 12 persone discriminate dalla boat drive, di più di persone cacciate dalla accoglienza, di più ragazzi che quindi siamo arrivati a un punto dove nessun servizio era a nostro favore, è lì che stiamo dicendo che aiutiamo noi vicenda. E lì abbiamo curato noi i nostri problemi, il nostro spazio di esserci, ma anche la sopravvivenza. E quindi in questo periodo alcuni ragazzi come me, come altri, sono molto concentrati su anche siamo Covid, anche come servizio immigrante, partecipando dei chiamati anche delle radio in comunità, ma allo stesso tempo facevamo anche servizio sulla comunità, perché come ragazzi BIFAL abbiamo una comunità qui che cercano da mangiare, cercano dove dormono, cercano cose anche, quindi non dobbiamo essere solo sulla lotta, sulla comunicazione, ma anche di fare pratica, anche aiuto i servizi che già abbiamo noi di bisogno, non di quelle che vengono a chiedere ai fratelli che quando un gruppo politico. Quindi durante questa esperienza di ricerca
Sorry, I'll translate. I'm not a professional translator, so apologies. During all these experiences of struggles that were carried on in the past years, we always felt the need to be at the forefront of this organizing. As a BIFAL community, we always foreground how we have to fight against the processes of criminalization, but most of us are affected by. Many of us have been incarcerated and criminalized as boat drivers. Everything you have said about the abolition of detention is really crucial for our analysis, so thank you for that. And we also have to think about how migrant communities have self-organized in these times. For instance, during the COVID time, the BIFAL community, which is a self-organized migrant community here in Palermo, which share this part, have created new infrastructures of care and solidarity where people could organize through practices of mutual aid and take care of problems that they faced, of survival spaces and services which were structurally denied by the state for migrants. So whilst services were denied and absent, people self-organized to provide these services for one another through the creation of food collectives, providing accommodation when needed, but also speaking to radios, programs, meeting online, and being always there for one another.
Per questo noi ci teniamo a portare un background di immigrazione dove noi chiamiamo il nostro collettivo gruppo politico ma immigratore, quindi questo include anche l'immigrazione in totale dove tutta l'immigrazione viene etichettata dai rifugiati, migranti, scafisti, quindi tutte queste etichette durante questo percorso di Covid, anche di percorso lungo di immigrazione, abbiamo avuto abbastanza subito il servizio che già noi stessi non ce l'abbiamo, ma dobbiamo fornirla con cui facciamo solidarietà. E quindi lì abbiamo, sì, il motivo di cui portiamo anche davanti il approccio di abolire le carceri, e questo si tratta anche di cercare cosa significa anche colpevole, cosa significa anche condannare una persona, perché è cosa si tratta, dove noi, quando gruppo politico, di considerare quello che facciamo come gruppo di resistenza, perché non abbiamo vissuto parte nostra cosa chiamata giustizia. abbiamo vissuto solo l'abbandono organizzato, abbiamo vissuto solo il capitalismo, abbiamo vissuto anche il colonialismo, e quindi dentro di queste cose abbiamo vissuto anche dopo lo stesso 2019, anche fino al 2018, quando anche, come avete detto, d'Inghilterra, altre parti del mondo, la gente in solidarietà venivano anche criminalizzati anche loro stessi. Quindi noi facciamo parte di questi gruppi che lottano queste cose, ma di più con persone che sono anche nel rotte in Libia, in Tunisia per arrivare qui, quando anche freedom of movement, ma anche no border. E quindi questa riflessione si mette di capire anche di chiedere cosa significa solidarietà per tante persone. Quindi noi, il nostro approccio di fare abolire è che facciamo conoscere bene questo tema di queste persone, che anche noi, questo che facciamo come resistenza, questa è la vera solidarietà. Quando noi siamo qui a unire le nostre pratiche di informazione, nel frattempo noi eravamo sotto le bombe, sotto la violenza, sotto il minaccio, per uscirne, cavalcare le frontiere, trovare cibo per qualcuno, andare in barca per rischiare il carcere. Questa è la resistenza, questa è la vera solidarietà che rischiamo ogni giorno. Quindi ci siamo a abolire dentro di questo sistema che è già un abbandono organizzato di più, che noi che abbiamo subito queste cose non riusciamo a capire anche cose, perché sono cose che non siamo qui né esperti su cosa è vissuta, non siamo in figura giusta su cosa è vissuta, perché parlando di violenza sul mare, sul carcere, non è che tutti riescono a passarla bene. Abbiamo tanti problemi di sanità, dove i ragazzi già hanno problemi di tensione che sono molto gravi, quindi per noi una revisione aperta che già serve a tutti per andare avanti.
Sorry, background noise.
Diana, you're incredible to be able to translate all of that in one go.
I was just thinking that I won't be able because my notes are just some keywords, and I'll try to do interpretation, which is as close as possible to what Shek said, but it will not be a literal translation. So I'm sorry about that. So for all the reasons that he explained, we need to bring migration perspective to these struggles. We consider ourselves a political movement, not just a solidarity movement, where solidarity and resistance go hand in hand. And there are many labels we have always been subject to. That try to divide us, but we try to bring together a common approach where border abolition goes hand in hand with prison abolition. And for this reason, we also need to always question and think about what does the notion of guilt means, as our group is constantly criminalized. And as groups of solidarity and resistance, we have always been subjected and exposed to organized abandonment. And for this reason, we always need to come together to fight against this abandonment, but also resist, taking care of each other, but also resisting these structures. And as it was mentioned earlier, the people who fight against this abandonment and organize are constantly criminalized. And in fighting against this, we also are always in conversation with our brothers and sisters from Tunisia and Libya, who are together in a struggle for freedom of movement and against borders. And in this broader context, we always need to think about what abolition means, what solidarity means, what resistance means. For instance, we organize with people also in Libya and in Tunisia because we've been there, they've been there themselves, and even when other people were here discussing about techniques of resistance. they were in Libya under bombs during the civil war, and they still kept fighting to care for one another, to find ways of surviving, of mutual survival, but also of escaping these conditions. So maybe we are not experts on we're not always experts on our lived experience. For many of us, it's difficult to articulate these experiences, but it is still important to center these perspectives in our struggles. I think we're out of time. Non so se vuoi aggiungere una piccola cosa.
Non sappiamo il tempo.
Maybe I will just add 2 words to close this intervention. First of all, thank you so much, everyone. And second, I haven't really participated in the chapter. I've mostly facilitated the Sheikh and Majai contribution. But thank you for including me anyway. And my work is not really on detention, but more on practices of criminalization of solidarity and resistance. And I just wanted to add to what has been said, but I think as a result also of the 2020 mobilizations, abolition has become really central in our movements against borders. And maybe one of the features that in my experience, mostly as an activist, characterized the past 5 years has been the increased and intensified convergence between struggles against borders and struggles against prisons, which maybe first before were present more from a academic understanding of carceral border regimes, but I have the impression that movements of justice, migrant justice, and anti-carceral movements that started converging more and more with the awareness that we cannot dismantle borders if we do not also dismantle prison, and if we also do not dismantle the police, because as Annika said, they're also all part of a continuum of violence that characterize Europe and the US and in general global capitalism. And I think that one of the key elements that emerged in the past years has also been the understanding of a need to fight against borders, prisons, and police violence, but also the need of humanitarian abolition and the abolition of those infrastructures of so-called care that we have also discussed in the Border Criminologies conference that are the counterpart of border, prison, and police, and not an alternative. And yes, we are in Palermo, Sicily. We have, as Malbusa also based in Lampedusa, where this became clearer and clearer, because the Lampedusa hotspot before COVID had a hole and people could escape or be on the island and be in contact with people. After COVID, that hole has been closed, and the hotspot became de facto closed detention center with no contact between inside and outside. There's been a lot of struggles and mobilizations, but somehow in Lampedusa, most of the struggles ended when the Red Cross started becoming involved in the detention center. So yeah, the humanitarization of these forms of control is really key, and we need to fight against this as well, because of course the Red Cross didn't bring any amelioration of the condition inside the hotspots, but it only covered it with the language of care. And the last thing, and then I finish, is that I think that when we think about resistance against all these systems, more and more over the past years, we've been thinking about solidarity and mutual care informed by abolitionist practices, but maybe one element that we need to bring forward in the future is also material resistance against these infrastructures of power. And I really enjoyed the talks that talk about the cooperation between private and state contractors, between state and private contractors and their alliances. And I think that it is really necessary in our analysis and in our practices to more and more bring solidarities through direct resistance to the companies that actually profit and produce these forms of detention and carcerality, as they are at the center of a border carceral regime, and not just profiting from it, but actively enabling it. So thank you so much for this wonderful book and for giving us a space.
Thanks to Dan Sheikh for these like important interventions, but also I think it really close well all the conversation, the round of conversation that we had. And I think also being aware of time, I would probably now open the floor to questions and comments and, you know, any observation, insight people want to share with us. We're in a small group, so I think it's nice we have the opportunity for a more intimate conversation. Anna?
Maybe I'll make it back. Yeah. Thank you very much for everyone's great contribution. I've learned so much, and it's really engaging for me also as a researcher on immigration detention. So my question is actually for everyone, but inspired by Aino's idea that the concept of isolation came from resistance within detention. So how could academics really stop being simply someone trying to extract information from participants, but really co-producing knowledge and concepts with people with lived experience or different perspectives? So how could these concepts be generated and popularized beyond what we already have at the moment?
Thanks, Anna. Maybe we can collect a couple of more questions and then let people
I do have
reply.
2 more questions in my pocket. The same.
So please go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So give me a second. Yeah. So I guess my other question is actually inspired by Satira, but she unfortunately has left the meeting. So I was also wondering about the rhythm and ups and downs of resistance from within detention, because from the experience of detention resistance in Hong Kong, it was actually a bit depressing that hunger strikes are getting a very fierce response from the government, as it's not likely to be happening anytime soon because of increased precautions, and weaponization of immigration authorities. So it's kind of hard for me as a researcher and a concerned citizen to think of resistance in its, say, authoritarian context. So I wonder if there could be some inspirations from all of you from different parts of the world regarding factors that might lead to the ups and downs of resistance from within. That's my second question. And the third one is kind of more geared towards my own research agenda around Hong Kong. I'm interested in Teresa's research around Northern Ireland, because it's basically kind of a sub-sovereign entity with separate border enforcement interests from the mainland, like Hong Kong's relationship with mainland China. So I wonder if it reveals something about the independence of border control, detention, and deportation. Well, despite we always link it to sovereignty. Yeah, these are my questions.
Thanks, Anna. Very important, meaningful questions. I don't know if everyone else had anything else to add. Otherwise, we also had prepared a question, but maybe, I don't know, Annika, maybe it's a good time to share it just before we open final round. And this question was what unanswered questions remain and what future avenues for action, analysis, and resistance do we envision in this time of polycrisis? So this was our final questions as well. So maybe I'll just, share it. I don't know, I'll open the floor to whoever wants to contribute.
Just maybe a short answer to the question on isolation and co-producing knowledge, because maybe, I don't know, we can say something about it, but I think isolation is real and isolation is constantly enforced, but one of the key mechanism of the resistance is to break the isolation, and it can happen in several ways, and it can be letter writing between people in detention and people outside of detention. It can be going outside of detention centers or prisons and organize mobilizations to let our presence be felt, and maybe give phone numbers that people can see and then they can call, to have conversations and access to alternative legal support. So the isolation is constantly enforced, but there are so many ways of resisting it that, this is a first step to start producing knowledge together and to also speak about detention from the perspective of those who are resisting it from inside, rather than imposing our vision on or our gaze on the forms of resistance or of forms of violence that are happening inside. I don't know if that makes sense.
Should I also go? Yeah, because it mentioned me, the first question. I think all these questions are brilliant, but maybe I will answer the first one. So it was on starting with isolation and then how researchers can work against extractivism in knowledge production. So so my research really started from activism, as I think most of us are researchers here. So we start as parts of social movements. And for me, it started when I met Rex Osa, who's an organizer originally from Nigeria, and he's been part of this self-organized refugee movement in Germany since 20 years. And he has kind of this method of breaking isolation with other people and groups who have taken this slogan, break isolation, and went into those camps, many of them also living in those camps, and started organizing and connecting different camps to each others and building campaigns and movements through these actions. Thanks. So that was kind of the starting point. And I think as researchers, we do have a lot of time resources and connections and networks that we can bring into this kind of activity. And I think for me, it was like important to work on 3 different levels. So I think the mutual aid that was mentioned is super crucial. So even when we do political work and combine this with activism, it's not enough for people who don't identify as activists, who are in dire situations. So we need to support them with the resources that we have. So legal counseling, different kind of social counseling, any kind of practices of mutual aid are crucial. Then when we do our work within the activist community and produce knowledge within that community, it's important to contribute to those communities. So what we did a lot was reporting from protests, court hearings, police raids, charter deportations, and we blogged and published all these monitoring reports. And we also called for activists to attend when there were protests and court hearings, and help to organize protests by people who have no experience of organizing protests in Germany. And we also did a lot of transnational networking between West Africa and Germany. This was very important in the last 10 years when EU has been externalizing control a lot to the African continent. And then publishing like interviews and roundtables and this kind of formats for which activist knowledge is which are better appropriate for activist knowledge than academic platforms. And then third area of intervention, I think, are these for academics, these state-centered frames of analysis that were also mentioned, like humanitarianism, law enforcement. So Francesca said in the beginning that we should not think of border enforcement as sort of law enforcement, but actually it's a political project. So what kind of political project it is, and how can we contest those logics as academics? Labor is another framework through which migration is often used, like viewed, disciplined, thankful, cheap labor. So those frames, and I think Eurocentrism and imperialism are also super important to challenge. And I think what the perspective of West African diaspora movements tells us is really to challenge this kind of more Euro-African racialized capitalism. So I think those are kind of the areas where I would see how researchers can challenge extractivist knowledge production. And just mention very briefly to Francesca's question, what are the kind of future avenues of work and analysis? I think I would just repeat what I said in the end of my input, that I see anti-imperialism as crucial avenue for abolitionist no-border organizing. And I think I would add that to organizing against prisons, policing, borders, and imperialism. And I think forging alliances with Palestine Solidarity Movement is a crucial thing to do, because that's the moment where these connections are being currently thought a lot about, and who has been very successful in forging these kind of alliances.
Thank you so much, Aino, and Diana, for your interventions. Perhaps I would, Tere, David, do you have points you wish to add to this regarding addressing any of the questions, or including Francesca's question regarding what remains and where are we now and where should we be heading? Oh, David, you're muted.
Thank you so much for everyone. There were there is a lot of takeaways, and that's where we are now. But it seems the system is stronger than people who are demonstrating. But one day, I think the system is going to be weaker. And we have to know now, how do we go forward by what we are doing now? It's not for me, for my lived experience only, but it's for those who are still detained, those who are still in the society waiting for their papers to be processed. Some of the people I know in Beyond Detention, where I attend, it's called Friendship on a Wednesday. There's some people who are still very afraid to speak out. The reason is because they are still waiting for their papers. They don't know what is going to happen. So I think you and I, we are in a position to speak for them. You know, I think that's what I can say at the moment. Thank you so much.
Okay. So maybe what I can say is, first of all, that I've enjoyed very much having this book launch today. this conversation at a moment of crisis here in Northern Ireland and in the wider UK, with emotions running high and fear being very palpable among the migrant communities. So I think it's really important to connect what others have said, just not to keep people isolated. And one of the things that actually we have learned in Northern Ireland, unfortunately, there's been recurrent episodes of violence by the white local population, mostly against racialized people, in what were defined as pogrom in multiple forms, from the setting aflame of the Islamic Center, of the shops owned by people of color, attacks to Deliveroo people. It's not something that is isolated, even though in this case what we have is the twisting of the discourse for which they are instrumentalizing a criminal event, a tragic event, with the aim of inflaming more violence. And I think this discussion with people who experience forms of racialization, criminalization, border violence everywhere are very, very important. I've also enjoyed very much the opportunity to look back and take a longer perspective to the analysis of state violence and border violence, because very often I feel we are kind of trying to catch up with whatever movement the state is or the private company is making to enforce border violence. And I think it can be helpful to reflect back and look at the kind of longer trajectory of that development. In terms of the question from Anna on the independence of Northern Ireland, there's not much independence. The detention centers here are definitely run under the power of the Home Office. There are opportunities to contest aspects of it in relation to the human rights framework that is ingrained in the peace agreement. And I know lawyers have tried and been waiting for special cases to fight them in court, mostly to assert the independence of Northern Ireland and to assert a different concept to assert their hospitality, to assert a different sense, that a different apprehension of what it means to be running away from conflict, an experience that a lot of people here will understand. So that's all I can say in this occasion.
Thank you very much, Tere. Thanks all of you for so eloquently answering those very complex questions as well. Are there any further questions or points that any of you would like to raise, including speakers, of course, speaking to what has been said already or to each other? We're including by Francesca, of course, or myself, who can only sort of reiterate what Tere said. It's been such it's felt very important and like a breath of fresh air to sit down with all of you tonight and listen to your important perspectives, listening to you sharing what has been, where we are at and where we must be heading, the voices that and the issues that continuously need to be centered and pushed through if we are to resist these destructive systems that we are confronting from our various points of view and perspectives in our various locations, and to continue to connect, learn from one another, and struggle for a different world, right? So from my side, yeah, I can only thank all of you so much for your fantastic contributions, and thanks everyone who stayed listened in and stayed through tonight. Francesca and Tere, you looked like you were taking a breath to say something, so I'll hand over to you.
No, I just wanted, thank you, Annika. I just wanted to thank everyone and for being here. And I think, I think what Teresa said, I think it's really important and resonates a lot. And I think it's times that are really difficult and challenging, and in which sometimes we feel despair. It's important to keep having moments, different moments in different ways, to come together, share, learn from each other, and also feel that we're not alone, isolated. I think it gives us strength. And although sometimes it's also difficult because we talk about very difficult things, as Mary always says, it's sometimes depressing. We come out from this meeting more depressed than how we came in. But I think it's also important. It gives also hope, and so I bring some also hope and strength, and ideas and insights, reflections that will stay in my mind over the next days and weeks and months. And I hope the book will be just a tool, one of the many that we're creating and co-creating, to just spark conversations and have moments where we can think together about what is around us and how we can contribute to understand it and possibly also help changing it. So thank you, and thank you to Border Criminologies as well for hosting us.
Yes, thank you very much. And please, if you get to read the book eventually, let us know what you think, what you make of it. Send us comments of any kind or question, even at a later stage. Or if you're watching this video online, do the same. Please feel free to contact us. We welcome comments, feedback, observations. And thanks again to Border Criminology, Anna, for doing the work behind the scenes and in the scene, and everyone who has helped getting here. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the event. I just want to make sure that Annika had the chance to share the QR code. If not today, regarding the book sales, we could also share it with the Border Criminologies network more widely, or at the end of this video, just so everyone knows that they can purchase a book or ask their universities to purchase it.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
It is still quite expensive, so get the university to buy it if you can.
Yeah.
So thanks again, everyone, and we'll discuss later on if we can publicize some of the content from here, and I look forward to chatting with you again on another occasion.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Okay.